So welcome everyone to our spoken history for this evening. We are doing Etched in Stone. For those of you that are joining us online, I just want to remind you, so we do have people here in the library and online at home. So anybody at home, your camera and your mic are off, so don't worry about that. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and drop those in the Q&A. If you're having technical issues and you can't hear me, go ahead and put those in the chat and I'll do my best to deal with those. One thing when we're doing questions here afterwards, if anybody in the audience has questions, I'm going to ask Dennis to repeat them so that people at home or on a recording can hear those because they're not really picked up from the audience. And we will be doing our best to get to all the questions at the end. So this presentation will be recorded and will be available online. So if you have friends who couldn't make it, or you want to watch it all over again and again, it is available on our YouTube page through our website. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dennis, who is joining us tonight from Brown County, and I'm going to take it away.
All right. Good evening, folks. My name is Dennis Jacobs, and I've been doing this cemetery stuff since Jesus was a child, basically. I'm only 54 years old, so it's been a long time, most of my life. As it was said, I'm from Brown County. I live in Green Bay, and I'm actually a library associate in the Adult Services and Local History Genealogy departments at the Brown County Library. This talk started way back in the 1990s with good old-fashioned slides and a slide projector. I presented it for a genealogy group. So let's get started. One thing that I also do on the side, which I should be doing tonight, but because this talk was scheduled, I do cemetery tours in Brown County. Here's one where I'm playing Mr. Joseph Nugent, who is a very interesting gentleman who was pretty successful in many businesses he worked in. But when Prohibition happened, he got involved in some bootlegging. And he got busted for that. So it was a fun character. And tonight, if I would be back in Green Bay, I'd be playing Mitch and the Jedlow, who was the founder of Bay Beach. So if you've been to Green Bay and Bay Beach Amusement Park, he's one who started that. So I'll do him Saturday. So as I mentioned, I started this program back in the 1990s. So in 1993, the university, UWGB, did a program, they called it Ancestral Pursuit. It was a big genealogy conference, and I was asked to do my cemetery research for that. It was all slides. So I ended up in the newspaper talking about all the cemetery stuff back in 1993. So that's how long I've been doing this program for. And of course, a fun fact about me is, remember Extreme Home Makeover? So in 2010, they were down in Neenah, Wisconsin, and I was chosen as one of the volunteers to work the commissary tent for the programs. I worked that very first Monday of the week that they were doing the shooting. So I got to meet Derek Huff and a couple other of the Dance with the Stars people that were there for that show. All right, so what's the difference between a cemetery and a graveyard? Does anybody know that? No? The big difference is a cemetery is usually a freestanding organization. So it's usually a non-denominational, sometimes the city or the county owns it or a township owns it, but it's usually freestanding. A graveyard is usually attached to a church. You've heard of churchyards, well, a graveyard. So sometimes they might be right next to the church, or there'll be a piece of property that's owned away from the church, but it's still affiliated with the church. So that's the big difference between cemeteries and graveyards. Today, we kind of use that term either way. So they mentioned cemeteries are freestanding, churchyards are graveyards. And I just love this photograph because somehow I captured a little fly up in that upper right-hand corner. I don't know how I did it. But this is a cemetery. This is a small town cemetery. And this one's down near Spring Green. This is kind of a fun one. They went through and restored the whole cemetery. So everything is nice, even rows, everything is level. And it was full of those metal crosses. It was just an incredible cemetery. That's down in Oshkosh. All right. So one thing about the Victorian age, which most of these stones I talk about is that time period, is they designed the cemeteries to be like a park. So this is in Princeton, Wisconsin. You can see the cemetery plan shows like a 4-leaf clover. If you look at the Google Earth image looking down, you can still see that circular kind of four-leaf clover pattern. They are meant to be more of going to visit your loved ones and strolling through a cemetery, having a picnic lunch. They made it into a park, basically. In Green Bay, where I'm from, we have Woodlawn Cemetery, which was developed in 1867. And we always joke that there isn't straight lines in that cemetery. Everything's these curved roads because they made it into a park situation. That's the same they did here in Princeton with that four-leaf clover, which isn't very efficient for burying people because you have all this empty space. And of course, cemeteries are full of art. So this beautiful colonnade. So let's talk about different headstones. Some of these we don't have in our area because they're from out east. The most common we have here are going to be the marbles and then getting into the cast iron or the granites. So slate is normally found in New England. It's usually a slab shape. It's from the 1700s. It does suffer very badly from water. And what happens is slate is multiple layers that are forced together and water gets between them and kind of forces the pieces apart. You can kind of see on that one edge of the headstone where it started to delaminate a little bit from water getting in. And it's oftentimes water will go into it and it's hollow. So if you're doing like a gravestone rubbing or chalking, you'd be pushing on a stone, all of a sudden the whole stone just collapses. So because the whole thing hollowed out inside. So you should never touch a slate stone because you never know how much of the interior is rotted out of that stone. Up here we have white marble. Since Wisconsin's pretty much settled in the 1830s and 40s and on, that's the stone that's most common in our cemeteries. All different shapes and sizes. You see all different types of things, slabs, obelisks, statues made out of it. As I mentioned, 1830s to 1880s is when it's most popular. Unfortunately, it suffers from acid rain. And what happens is marble is a bicarbonate, just like an antacid or like baking soda. And when you add an acid to it, it dissolves. And so what's happening now with our air pollution, it creates acid rain. And when it hits those white stones, they dissolve. So that's what's happening now is they're starting to see the face of those stones disappear. They can be cleaned with a soft brush and distilled water. And now there's a new product called D2 that's an antifungal or anti-organic item. You can spray it and that eventually will clean the stone too. That's supposed to be safe. The next stone that we have in our area is a gray marble, and they're usually in these square pillars. They call them cathedral style. 1880s to 1900 they're used. They're a different type of marble, but they're also susceptible to acid rain and they'll start to eventually dissolve a little bit. And again, you can clean them with just distilled water and a soft, like a vegetable brush or a nylon brush. Never use a metal brush because that'll just chew them up. And then we have these fun ones with the industrial age. We have these, what they call white bronze or zinc. They're normally found in the eastern half of our country, so Mississippi River east. They come in all different shapes and sizes. They're usually four-sided. And what's really cool is it's a frame and then you can put different panels into it. So you could order different artwork to go onto it for based upon how you want the person to be remembered. And when you tap on them, you can tell they're hollow. And they're really kind of cool when you find them. 1870s, about 1912 is when those were used. And of course, we have cast iron, another part of the industrial age. Unfortunately, if they get banged too hard, that cast iron can snap because it gets brittle over time. They originally were painted. A lot of them were silver. But unfortunately, over time, rust starts to corrode them. 1860s, about 1900. And again, it's part of that industrial age when they start having the foundries that can pour this type of stuff. And of course, today, the most common that we have throughout our country is the granite, polished granite or rough granite. The only thing that really can damage it is going to be vandalism, knocking them off their bases. 1880s, they start up and then they go up to current time. And then there's one that's a concrete or it's also manufactured stone, which are these usually tree trunks. And they're part of a fraternal order. We'll talk about that a little bit later. 1890s to 1920. And there's also wood. So if you ever go into the cemeteries and you are looking for an ancestor's grave and you can't find it, it might have been a wood cross. And over time, that wood cross will rot away. And if it doesn't get replaced, that grave is lost. I took this photograph out at Virginia City in Nevada, where that headstone is still standing. And some actually were beautifully carved. But the wood ones in our area, because of our damp climate, they just don't last. You have to constantly replace that cross. So what do the symbols mean? So if you look at our sheet, the first one is the anchor. And you can see the anchor at the top of that stone. There's a couple different meanings for it. One of them is the soul is anchored in God's harbor. Also, what's interesting is if you ever tour any type of early Christian sites in Europe, a lot of times you'll see the anchor being shown as a Christian symbol because it represents a cross. It was one way of disguising it from the Romans, because the top of the anchor makes that cross, but they have the little swoop on the bottom that helps disguise it. So it's an early Christian symbol to show that you're a Christian, but it's also that you're anchored to God's heaven or anchored to God's graces. There you can see the other one. So we have the angel, which is usually designated as genderless, neither male or female. It's a messenger of God, and sometimes it's actually taking the soul to heaven. They're always dressed in very classical clothing, mostly like Greek togas, that type of thing, and usually a winged creature. And you can see one mourning. And you see when a cast iron cross that has one. And one praying by the cross. So the arch, you're going to start seeing architectural items on headstones. And so you have an arch there, and the arch is basically the gateway into heaven. So the person who put that stone up for the family member has in their mind that this person has gone off to heaven. So you'll see the arches in all different shapes and sizes. So you can see this one has two pillars, and then there's an arch at the top of the stone. So it's very architectural looking. And then we have a Bible. And usually there's usually two different types of books that are used. The Bible will usually say Holy Bible across it, which just designates that the person's Christian. So you can see the word Holy Bible across the top of the Bible, across the top of that book. But then you have the Book of Life. And the Book of Life will sometimes have the person's birth date and death date on it. It's meant to represent a person's deeds. They always talk about going up to St. Peter with your list of sins and your list of good things you've done. That's the Book of Life. So everything that you've done in your life, whether it was good or bad, is recorded in this book so that you can enter heaven. Sometimes you'll see it clasped or closed from the end of life, like the one on top of this stone here. And then this one is one of those zinc ones where it's simply open with her name on it, and it just says at rest. So it gives her birth year and death year, and that's her Book of Life. Broken chain. So you can see there the link is broken, and what it represents is the death of a family member. They've lost a daughter, lost a son, lost a brother or sister. Don't get this confused with the Odd Fellows, which have the 3 interlocking loops. This is what you're always going to see, a broken chain for the loss of a family member. As I mentioned, there's lots of architecture in the cemeteries. We have columns, and again, the same photograph, you can see the 2 side columns. Some people believe that they wanted architecture in there so it was a familiar place for the dead. You know, you're losing a family, or you're putting them into the earth, but you want something that they'll remember, or that'll be something that they'll notice or they'll remember in their lifetime or their death time at that point. So columns. The base of this one has 4 columns, one in each corner, and here's one large column. It's all just architectural, meant to give a little bit of familiarity for the dead. But then you have broken columns. So you can see that the column is snapped. And a broken column just means end of life. It might be a tragic ending, but it means that someone's life has ended. And it's just simply, and you'll see a couple of different other things that show broken items to show end of life. So you can see the column is toppled. So a cross, if you're Catholic, you see every Catholic cemetery has crosses in it. There's all different styles of crosses. I'm trying to track it down exactly where it is in the Catholic doctrine, but for a while that they believe that when Christ's second coming happens, the Catholics believe that only the graves that have crosses on them will be the ones that go up to heaven. So you'll see, you go into a Catholic cemetery, everything's crosses throughout Catholic cemeteries. Of course, that's changed now because doctrine has changed, but you can see all the different crosses. All right, the crown. The crown symbolizes victory or triumph over death. Think of a ruler. The king has a crown because he's victorious in battle. So the same thing with a crown on a gravestone, you're victorious over death and you've gone off to heaven. So you'll see crowns in all different things. This one, you can see the Oddfellows 3 chain across the bottom of the crown. But there's a crown. Here's a cross and a crown. And do you see the crown in this one? The very top of the pillar has a crown on it. The day I found that one, I was just like, what? It was just very surprising. It's very subtle, but there's a crown on there showing victory over death. So we have the dove. And of course, dove symbolizes peace or a messenger of God or the Holy Spirit. So you'll see doves on a couple different stones. And the drape. The drape represents the funeral pall. So when you go to a funeral, they drape that large white pall on top of the casket when they do the final rites. That's what it's meant to represent. So here you can see with that book of life carved into that pillar is a drape. You can just make up the tasseling on it. This one, it's hard to see, but on the very top, it's a little square drape with little tassels in each corner. This one, they have the drape going across the whole top of the stone. And again, it's meant to be that funeral pall. And then we have this pillar with this really cool drape across the top of that pillar. And then here we have an urn with the drape across the top of the urn. So it's all in just part of that funeral decoration or funeral art. So flags. When I'm doing my research, I noticed that almost every stone that had a flag, the person died during the Civil War. And that's the only stones I'm finding on are the men who gave their life during the Civil War, have the American flag going across it. So usually if you're walking through a cemetery and you see that flag, you know, it's the Civil War. It's a person who died during the Civil War. And this one, I like this one. This one's down in Outagamie County, near Appleton. And it has 2 cross flags, a cannon, and a little stack of cannonballs. So it's just, it's an interesting little stone. But again, this young man died during the war. So flowers, I've only got a couple of them. If you ever want to look up, the Victorians had a whole etiquette book on what a flower meant. So if you got a bouquet of flowers as a young lady, each flower had a certain meaning. I've only put a couple on here because the list would be forever. So we have calla lilies. So you'll see it carved in that little arch. And a calla lily symbolizes youth and rebirth. It all represents holiness, faith, and purity. Of course, we all think of as lilies as being pure anyways. So that's just part of that lore. So you can see a potted calla lily in the front. Then a regular lily. So you can see that up on top there. Again, symbolizes purity and innocence. Of course, some of these stones are absolutely gorgeous with the amount of relief cuts that are in it. There you can see the lily up on top of the obelisk.
Dennis, that last one that you just showed with the lilies carved into it, is that a marble or a granite or?
The question, we have a question about this headstone, whether it's granite or marble, and it's a granite. It's a marble stone. So it's marble. So the rose, and you'll see the rose, and everyone knows that rose means beauty. There's all those different poems and stories about the rose, just symbolizing the beauty of someone's soul. So do you see the roses on this one? Look around the edge of the cross. Rosebuds on all around the whole cross. So if you see a rose bud, a closed rose, it usually symbolizes the death of a child. And a lot of times you'll see them where it's kind of snapped off the branch a little bit and just dangling there. Here someone's holding a small rosebud that's closed. And you can see this child was only 4 months old when they passed away. So it's death of a young child. And this one, if you look, you'll see the big rose, but there's a little teeny rosebud underneath the big rose blossom. So if you see a bouquet of roses, it just signifies someone's beauty. So the person who assembled this stone for this person obviously thought she was a very beautiful lady. So she deserved a whole bouquet of roses. And it's hard to see, but in the very center is a vase full of roses. So we have gates. And again, the gates symbolize going through the pearly gates, symbolizing going into heaven. So some are pretty obvious when you see the symbols. But you can see all different gates, and they're usually attached to an arch. So if you look at grapes, do you see the grapes in this stone? They're in the very center of the cross going up. There's a grapevine. Grapes symbolize someone who's lived a long life. So think of when you go out to harvest a grape. Do you want green grapes that are sour and bitter? Or do you want purple grapes that are sweet and succulent? So you only can harvest grapes when they're ripe. So that means that person lived a long life. The Grim Reaper. We don't have as many of them here in the Midwest. Out east, you see a lot more Grim Reapers on those early colonial stones than you do here, but there's a few in Wisconsin. So here you can see them. They usually look like Father Time. This one has an angel with the sickle and that. Basically, it's the angel of death taking the soul to heaven. And usually you'll see the sire, the sickle with them. But here you can see the broken pillar. You can see you start looking at these stones, you start having multiple meanings when you start looking at them. If you see stones that are half carved, like this one where you can see the column, but then it's rough, it means a transition from life to death. And one of my favorites are the hands. So you have the fingers that point up. And it simply means that the person's soul has gone to heaven. Unless the stone's fallen down and the person's soul has gone to the left. Because a lot of those stones have tipped over now and pointing this way. But there you can see that both people have gone to heaven. And that one has a bunch of roses around. So she's a beautiful lady that's gone to heaven. And this one I thought was really cool when I found it, because normally when they show the pointing, it's usually the hand like this, and this one the hand's reversed. So you don't see the fingers. So either the stonecutter didn't know how to cut fingers properly and did it this way. We're not sure, but this is the only time I've seen it where the hand is pointed this way instead of this way. Yes. There's a question about what year this person died. Looks like 1864. It could be, it just depends on how talented the stonecutter is. So the question was about why this hand is carved backwards versus the other ones, and we're not sure. It could be because it was a novice person doing it. Stonecutter's been around for a long time, so it's hard to say. But it's the only one I come across in all my travels that I've seen the hand the other direction. So we have hands that are clasped. And there's usually a couple different meanings for hands that are clasped. Sometimes if you look at the cuffs and you see a more masculine cuff and a more feminine cuff, it usually means a married couple. But if you see the cuffs are the same, male and male, that could be God clasping the person's hand and taking the person with. So there's a couple different meanings for that. This one is clearly, you can see a more feminine cuff versus a more masculine cuff. This one doesn't have any cuffs, so it's hard to say. Again, it could be a stonecutter not being that great either. And then this one, again, you can see a more feminine cuff on the left side versus the right side. Hands reaching down. And again, that's that broken chain one, but the hand is reaching down. It's supposed to be God's hand coming down to pull the soul to heaven. So, and we have the heart. And it's the heart basically is love, mortal love, God's love, courage, and intelligence. So this one actually has two hearts. One's facing up and one's facing down. I haven't come across the meaning why they did that, but it's a heart. We have Heavenly City. These are kind of cool when you find them. Kind of looks like Oz in the background, but it's supposed to be, again, going through the pearly gates, and there's heaven. There's those multiple rooms that they talk about in the Bible and that. So it's just kind of fun, but every time I see it, it always looks like Oz from Wizard of Oz. And we have the lamb. So you can see the little lamb in the corner. Lambs always represent a death of a child. So whenever you're in a cemetery and you see that little lamb on the stone, it always means that a child has died. So lambs are meant to be innocent, which children are innocent. So you'll see lambs. Here's one laying on top of a stone with a drape. And this one is two lambs side by side. Of course, I always joke about this one because it looks like two otters because the Assyrian has eaten the ears off of them. So it's two otters side by side. But it's just, again, showing that two children have passed away in this family. And then here we have three stones. They're all connected. And three children, there's three lambs, one on each stone for three children that died for this family. Laurel wreaths. The laurel wreath, think of the Olympics. The early Olympics, they always wore laurel wreaths in their hair when they won the contest. So that's the same thing. Laurel wreaths signify the victory over death. The soul has gone to heaven. So you can see with this one that has the drape. On the other side of it is a laurel wreath wrapped on the other corner of the stone. And it's always so funny. So when I visit cemeteries, when I see a stone I've never seen before, I just get so excited. This one is at the entrance of Old World, Wisconsin. There's a little cemetery as you're entering Old World down in Eagle. And this cemetery is right next to the entrance. We stopped there one day and I was just like, oh my God, running around crazy in the cemetery. All right, so we have a bunch of leaves. And it's the same thing with the flowers. It's all different meanings. We have the ivy. So you can just make up the top of the stone has the imprint of ivy across it. And ivy symbolizes the steadfast of faith. My great-great-grandparents' stone has ivy around the base of their stone. So they're very, very strict Catholics, and it just shows that they were very strong in their faith. You can see the ivy up on the arc, the little peak of the cathedral on that one. And we have oak. And this one is really cool because if you look at the border around the whole stone, it's all oak leaves. And oak symbolizes that strength and faith. Think of the mighty oak tree and how strong the oak trees are. So it's that same symbolism that person had a very strong faith. They can move mountains practically. This one's down in Beaver Dam. But it was a beautiful stone. It has a finger pointing up and it has a cross. So it has all different symbols attached to it. There you can see in the peak of the cathedral on the pillar, oak leaves. And then you have the palm. So think of Palm Sunday, it's the salvation of the soul. And so you see lots of palms on different stones. So if we go to the obelisk, so one thing that's interesting when you look at cemeteries, and the obelisk is one of them, you can tell what time period the stones were put up by the different elements in it. Obelisks are Egyptian for the god Ra. They point up to the sky. In the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, the classics were very popular. So Egyptian mythology, Greek and Roman mythology were all very popular trends. So in cemeteries, they started putting obelisk. Again, it's pointing to the sky. So it's also said that the soul has gone to heaven, but it's part of that culture of the time period that you're going to see those elements. If you look at 20s and 30s stones, there's some Art Deco decoration on them. So you start seeing the trends, what's current trends in our society. But obelisk, that's one of my favorites. You walk in the cemetery and you'll see obelisk everywhere. And it's all, again, pointing to the sky that the soul's gone up. You'll see large obelisks in the center of a family plot with small stones around it, or you'll see a single obelisk with family members on that obelisk. But it's part of that cultural trend and part of that soul gone to heaven. And they can be really ornate. So the scroll, and you can see that one has it hanging off one of the stumps. The scroll is the same symbol as the book of life. So all your deeds have been recorded on that scroll, and it's there for St. Peter to look at, whether you go to the gates or not. You see the scroll on this stone? It's laying across the face. It also has a drape, it has a wreath, it has lots of different things on it. And then this one has a scroll at the very top of the woodpile. So again, their deeds have been recorded for them to be judged. So you'll see some fun ones, which are these spheres. And a sphere basically means it's life eternal, because there's no ending and no beginning. It's just a circle. What's really interesting is there's one cemetery, I think it's in Ohio, that they've marked it and because the sphere is separate. It just sits on that granite base, and with water getting into it and wind, the little sphere rotates. So they've marked it and they've seen that it's moved so much because of wind and elements and that type of thing. So it's kind of cool. But you can see lots of different spheres. The star, and I just came across this one recently, but you can see the star there. It's an early Christian symbol which represents the 5 wounds of Christ. So that's what that one is. It also means eternal life, because you think of the stars up in heaven. But you can see they're all different shapes and sizes. This one has a cross inside of it. So again, multiple meanings. Tree of life. So if the tree is cut down or cracked down, it means it symbolizes life is cut short. This stone comes from up in Door County, and a little cemetery in Clay Banks, which is in between Algoma and Sturgeon Bay. And what I like about this one is, okay, it's just a stump of a tree, but the child must like to hunt because there's a rifling against that stump. So it's just sort of a fun find. If you see urns, which usually on top of most of the stones, it symbolizes that the physical body is buried there. And you can see all different shapes and sizes of urns. And then this one I think is incredible. Look at the detail work in that drape that's on top of that urn. And then weeping willow. So weeping willow, of course, symbolizes mourning, or the feeling that you have when you mourn. And also what's interesting is when you cut down a willow tree, what happens? It grows back. So it also symbolizes eternal life. So just those where the branches drape shows that weeping or that mourning of the death. But then if the tree gets cut down, it resprouts. And you'll see them, they're very popular in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. You see a lot of stones with weeping willows and all different types of weeping willows. So if you see a wheat sheaf, which I've only come across 2 or 3 in all my travels, but a wheat sheath means, again, when do you harvest wheat? When it's mature. So it's usually the death of an elderly person that's lived a full life, because you can't harvest wheat when it's green. You have to wait till it turns golden and it's matured. So it usually symbolizes someone who has had a full life. This one's from somewhat near here. It's down in Hancock, Wisconsin. There you can see a little sheet of wheat on top of that pillow. And there's another one right there. And just when I say I never see them, also one day I came across like 3 of them. I'm just like, well, that happens. So if you get into the fraternal orders, there's all different types of groups. You have the Masons, you have Odd Fellows, you have Elks Club, you have all these different organizations. So they all have different symbols they put on their stones to show off that they're part of that organization. So the Freemasons will usually have the compass and the scale, and usually the letter G. So you'll see those on quite a number of the stones, which are part of their symbols for the organization. And then a group that is no longer around because they've died out is the Grand Army of the Republic. These are Civil War veterans. They decided to form their own, basically, union to get the government wasn't giving them their veterans pay. So they organized to make a union, and they then were able to do a little bit more. You know, we need our pensions, we need this, we need that. So you'll usually see their badge. It's what they wore that badge when they had their meetings with the star and then the American flag on the bar. So if you ever see stones that have that on it, they were a Civil War vet at one time. And part of that. So this one's hard to make out, but there's a GAR. I blew it up as best I could. So that's a GAR carving into that stump one. And this one actually has just GAR at the very top of the urn. And again, just turn the corner, and this is out in Clintonville. So I just turned the corner one day. I'm like, oh, look at that GAR. So Odd Fellows, I'm not sure if you guys have an Odd Fellows Hall here in Marshfield. We have a very large one in Green Bay. Odd Fellows is a fraternal order. You have Odd Fellows, and then the female versions, Rebecca's. And they run a nursing home in Green Bay. They're always into bettering society. That's their big thing. They're philanthropists. And they're always going to have the 3 locked rings. And you'll sometimes see International Order of Odd Fellows across it, or just those 3 rings that are joined will symbolize that they're Odd Fellows. But if you look at this one, they have columns, they have the gate, they have the arch, they have the laurel wreath, they have the palm. So they're saying a lot in that stone. And again, across the front of the crown is Odd Fellows. So the Woodmen of America was a union for woodcutters. And it's hard to see on this one, but there's a little mallet and axe that are crossed. And that symbolizes that they're part of that organization. So you can see this one has the mallet on the ground and the axe and the log. And this one, I'm trying to think where it is. I think it's in the scroll. And there's also the Women of the World. And they have this shield that says Women of the World that goes around. So miscellaneous. So some things that aren't on my list, we're getting to some fun stuff now. Again, part of the cemetery is they wanted to make their dead ones comfortable. So this one's a cushion. So it's that comfort of being home in bed or being on a sofa and having a cushion. This one I found is a pen. Must like to write or something. So there's a script. A rocking horse. Two lovebirds or two doves that are facing each other. An anvil. So sometimes it shows up what occupation the person wants. A praying child. A sleeping child. So again, the child has passed away. So again, it's that comfort of being in a bed. It's the gravestones are more for our purposes, and this makes the person feel more comfortable that the child is at rest comfortably. And this one's almost life size. This is down near Columbus, Wisconsin, in a small town called River Falls. And they actually did a full relief of the child sleeping on a pillow. A swastika. Before the Nazis ruined it, it actually meant prosperity or good luck. It's also a Japanese symbol, but then what happens is the Nazis corrupted it, and now everyone's like, oh. But yeah, you'll find some symbols that mean other things than what we think of today. So if you come across stones on top of gravestone, there's a couple different things that are part of that. It helps to ward off evil spirits. Stones last longer than flowers do. We have a Jewish cemetery in Green Bay, and when you go out there, all those stones have stones. It just shows that they were there to visit. So you'll see graves, you'll see stones on top of that. They also believe that if you saw stones on top of the grave, it's to keep the evil person down in the grave too. So that's part of the vampire or werewolf superstition, that type of thing. And then you'll find coins on top of graves, usually veterans' graves, and there's a whole language for that. A penny means that you just visited the grave. The nickel indicates that you were in basic training or boot camp with that person. The dime means that you served side by side with that person. And if you see a quarter on top of it, that person was there when that person got killed. So at the national cemeteries, they'll go through and they'll collect these coins every year and put it into account. So if there's a veteran who died, who didn't have a family next of kin, they'll use that coinage to pay for their headstone. So if you ever see coins and stones, don't take them off. It means that the person has visited that veteran. So beware of hazards in the cemetery. And I have a couple of different stories about that. This is in Green Bay. We have a huge flock of turkeys at Woodlawn Cemetery. And when I was updating this from slides to PowerPoint, I was running around one day doing tons of photographs of stones. I just get it done for a presentation. And I had been out in Clintonville and it was a storm coming. So I buzzed to Green Bay and I'm like, I'll get the anvil photograph that's at Woodlawn. So I drove into the cemetery, parked on the bottom corner. I get out of my car and I start running to that gravesite before the rain starts. And I run into this flock of turkeys. And I'm like, oh dear Lord, they can maim, they can scratch. And every time the thunder roared, the tom turkey would go gobble, gobble, gobble. So every time it thundered, he would gobble. So I quickly got the photograph. I was running back to my car and I ran into a flock of geese. And I'm like, they're coming from both ways. I was also in when we did the cemetery tour we did a walkthrough on Tuesday night down at Woodlawn. There was at least 6 deer running through the cemetery. And Woodlawn is not in the heart of Green Bay, but it's in Green Bay. So there's a whole herd of deer running through the cemetery. And the thing is, we have a state highway below the cemetery and a busy county road at the top of the cemetery. So you have hazards in cemeteries. So some interesting finds. These are the fun ones I've come across as I do my travels. When I was down in Mobile, Alabama, I was visiting 3 times great-grandfather who had died of disease during the Civil War. And the National Cemetery Mobile was in the process of resetting all the stones in a part of the cemetery. You can stand at one location and turn, and everything is diagonally in line front to back, in line side to side. It's precision. It's beautiful. And it was really impressive. They were going through the time to reset this part of the cemetery. It was just really neat to see that happening. And one of my favorite things, again, it's just being the geek in me for being like a cemetery lover, is finding the stonecutters' names on the bottom of the stones.
Who's the biggest name on there?
Well, here's the little teeny one on the very bottom.
Oh,
So you can just see in the very bottom corners of the stonecutters' names. So it's really rare to find those. This one, you can kind of see there, I have it blown up so you can see it, but it's at the bottom of the stone. Usually they get kind of buried in the dirt, or they're so small they just wear away. And then this one is really funny because it's a gentleman whose first wife marries, and his first wife dies, and then the second wife dies, and he's buried between the two. And they all have their hands clasped. This one, I'm not sure what happened to the wife.
Don't.
Well, it never got carved. So either she remarried and moved away, or she's a different cemetery. And sometimes you'll start seeing more and more people put more and more information on the stones, on what battles they were in, that type of thing. So with the granite ones, you're starting to see stonecutters do more and more unique things to the stones. So here you can see this World War I vet lists what battle he got wounded in.
About the Civil War soldiers, was that both the North and the South, or just one?
Well, we have a question about the Civil War soldiers, whether both North and South. The GAR was mostly Union. There was a Confederate version of that same organization. And actually the Confederate group, from what I heard, they were suffering financially, and the GAR helped boost them up. So even though they fought against each other, after the war was done, they believed that they were full Union again, and they supported the Southerners also. So when they reenacted the Battle of Gettysburg, the 50th anniversary, the original soldiers were there. When they ran up to where they met, they hugged each other and they were crying. So the war was done with them, and it was done, and it was just something they experienced. So it's really, really a cool. When he started the Civil War, it's really a cool thing to see that. This stone is down near Spring Green, and they took 2 of those cathedral-style square pillars, and they put this big granite slab, and it gives the family's genealogy on that slab. So it tells you what part of Germany they're from, and then it tells you how they're all connected. So they spent a lot of money to do that big slab for that family genealogy, but it's absolutely incredible. And this also shows how family names can change. Coda, Zoda, Soda. It's all the same family, just different spellings of the name. This stone or this marker is for a ship that sunk near Two Rivers, Wisconsin. So it's commemorating the people who lost their lives during that shipwreck. This one's up in Brown County at the Lawrence Cady Cemetery. I just think it's the coolest thing. It's an anvil with his mallet, and his, I think its maul is the wedge that goes into it. It's just kind of cool to see that 3-dimensional.
Dennis?
Yes.
There's one here in Gate of Heaven that's like that. It's only it doesn't have the hammer on it, but it's got a full anvil, either carved or casted.
Okay, we had a comment about the Gate of Heaven Cemetery has a very similar stone that's just missing the mallet. You'll have a profile relief in it. This one's up in Casco, Wisconsin. It's a full-size doughboy from World War I. Unfortunately, he's weathering, so his nose is disappearing. And then what's really interesting, so when I found this one years ago, back in the 1990s, I went up and photographed it as a slide. And then again, getting ready for my presentation with the PowerPoint, I ran back up to Casco, which is only, 25 minutes from Green Bay. And when I got there, there's a trail cam attached to the gravestone next to it, photographing anybody who comes near the stone because they're worried about vandalism. This is down in Mobile. It's for a firefighter's plot. So they have the little firefighters' helmets on top of all the posts, and then the speaking trumpets are down on all the pillars. Southern cemeteries are very interesting to visit because they're not as lush as northern cemeteries because it gets too hot and everything burns out. You know, up here we have flowers and all this greenery, and down there it's just like barren. We have a bronze with Jesus knocking on the door. This one's down in Wisconsin Dells. This is Belle Boyd's grave. Those who are Civil War buffs will know who Belle Boyd was. She was a Confederate spy. And after the war was done, she became an actress. And so she was traveling the circuit, and she was stopped in Kilbourne City, which is now Wisconsin Dells. And she got sick and died. And her family couldn't afford to have her body shipped back to Virginia. So the GAR chapter there purchased the plot and had her buried there because they knew that she was of historical importance. Well, then years later, there's a legal battle going on about we can't have a southerner buried in Wisconsin. She needs to be buried in Virginia. So there's Virginia was suing Wisconsin Dells to get the body back. And Wisconsin Dells says, we don't own the plot. The GAR purchased it, and then the American Legion has taken over the GAR's role. We don't own it. So the compromise was they brought in a truckload of Virginia soil. So there's actually Southern soil buried on top of her now. They then took stones from all the different states. So the base of the platform is stones from all the states in Union. Then they capped it off so no one could steal her dirt. So she's a Southern woman buried in the North, buried in Southern soil. So that was I found out this story when I was at the Dells down at the cemetery. One of the caretakers came up and told me the story about this legal battle and that whole thing. So Belle Boyd, the Confederate spy, is buried in Wisconsin Dells in southern soil.
Wow.
Yes.
The doughboy with the nose going off, can that be repaired?
There's a question about whether that doughboy's nose can be repaired. They could do a composite of something different, but I'm not sure how long that will last or how when they attach it, how long that's going to attach on there. It's just slowly wearing off, unfortunately. So here's another story from Wisconsin's past. This is the boy who could not tell a lie. His parents had died, so he became a ward of his aunt and uncle. And his aunt and uncle murdered a traveling salesperson. So when they told the nephew, if someone comes asking about this person, tell him you never saw him. And he goes, I can't tell a lie. So he was brought into the barn and whipped until he passed away. So someone has erected this monument in his memory of the boy who could not tell a lie, because the aunt and uncle were prosecuted for the death of both the boy and their traveling salesperson. But he had, to his dying day, he could not tell a lie, that he could not make the lie up that he didn't know who the guy was. So that's down in the southern part of the state. And then sometimes you get these stories upon stories. They actually put like a whole paragraph on the stone. This one is for a pastor for a church down in Rock County, and it gives his whole life story. In a cemetery near here, there's a stone. I couldn't get a good photograph of it because it was so covered in lichen, but it was a guy who got struck by lightning on his back porch. And it said, like, so-and-so got struck by lightning on this date. And it just goes through his whole life story. But you'll never know, you won't believe what you find on these stones as far as their epitaph or their life story being written out. This one's down in Mukwonago. It is actually a freed slave. And it's basically his whole life story about coming up to Wisconsin with a officer he worked for the Union Army and then worked for a store. And I had to chalk it because it was so black, it was under a pine tree, and that stone was just pitch black. It was so covered in sap and pitch. But it gives his whole life story about him being emancipated. Frozen to death in the snowstorm of January 7th of 1873 in Minnesota, found January 18th, 1873. This is in Beaver Dam. This, I think, is the one talking about the lightning strike, and it's hard to get a good photograph of it. And here we have a mason who has looks like a haversack on part of it. Haversack's like this is apron. Okay, so it's part of the Masonic apron that they wear for their ceremonies. But you can see, and they actually have a masonry piece for him. It's kind of cool. And then up in Door County, one of Chief Oshkosh's descendants is buried up there, Roy Oshkosh. He has a really cool story. He opened up a souvenir shop in Egg Harbor. And what he did was he went back to he was Menominee Indian. He went back to the tribe and had the ladies of the tribe make those baskets and beadwork and ribbon work. And then he sold them to the tourists, and the money he raised went back to the tribe. So this is during the 30s and 40s when the tribes were really suffering and didn't have any money. He was furthering his tribe by selling trinkets to the tourists that were in Door County. And he's buried up in Egg Harbor. So that with today's technology and sandblasting, they can do almost anything into granite stone. So here we have a family that's from the Dells, decided to put Dells on their stones. Here's someone's farm. It's almost like golf. And then they actually put their family photograph in the back and colorized it. So you'll start seeing a lot of that in a lot of modern stones, but golf and baseball. You'll start seeing on the back, they'll start putting grandchildren's names in the backs of the stones. So you'll start seeing a lot of genealogy stuff on that type of thing. Do you see her birth date?
Yeah.
She's lived in 3 centuries. 1899, 1900s, and died in 2000. She lived through 3 centuries. This was a really cool one. It's just a big cube laying on its side. So something you'll see, when I was a child, I used to go to our local cemetery, and there was all these black and white porcelain photographs in the stones, which unfortunately now have all popped up because of frost and heaving and that. You can now do them black and white and in color and put them back on stones. So that's something they're bringing back. And it's not that expensive either. It's really kind of a cool thing, but you're starting to see more photographs back on stones again. Unfortunately, water will work behind it again and they'll pop off in the future, but they're nice to see now. So down on a pond, they found this young lady murdered. And they have a QR code so that you could take your phone and it'll give you the whole story. You could, if you knew the person, you could then contact the Fond du Lac County Sheriff's Department and say, I think it's so-and-so. Well, through DNA evidence, they disinterred her, took some DNA samples because they didn't have proper samples when they did it the first time, and then reinterred her. They have since found out who the identity of the person is. And she died from sex trafficking. And the tragic thing about her story is she was down in Beloit and she had called her mother saying, come get me. And the mother's like, I don't have time, I can't. And the next day she's died. She is found dead. They're still trying to figure out who the killer is. And of course, we have a large Hmong population in Wisconsin, so you're starting to see some fun, different headstones for that culture. including a recliner. And what's really funny is you see the little black thing on top of one of the arms. Someone glued a remote control to the top of the gravestone. Jukebox. And my last slide here, it's a little blurred out because it's a little racy. Forever in our hearts until we meet again, cherished memories known as our son, brother, father, papa, uncle, friend, and cousin. But if you read the left side vertically, it's F off. This was down in Des Moines, near Des Moines, Iowa, and it popped up on a news feed this year for me. I'm like, I have to include it because it is classic. It's a beautiful sandstone. That stone is just gorgeous. And the reason why the family did it is because that was his favorite phrase. But the whole town is fuming now because it's on a stone. Oh. So let's see, we talked about symbols. Let's see if you folks can figure out a couple of these symbols. All right, so there's an arch, which means they're entering the gates of heaven. There's the crown for death over victory over death. The drape, as far as that funeral pall or that mourning, for that comfort for the grave, the gate. And then in the keystone, you really can't see is the word love. Here's one more.
And you got the Bible.
So there's a closer look to it.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so the book of life's on top, recording the person's deeds. Again, that drape or that funeral pall. There's the arch going through the gates of heaven. The cross on the Christian, of course, they have Christ carrying the cross on this one. In the keystone is a star. So again, that eternal life. And then the metal piece on the bottom is a GAR marker. So Civil War vet. So it's all right. Unfortunately, when I sent the handout via a Dropbox, all of my book titles on the book page disappeared. So there are the titles for the first 3 books. So if you want to record those. I can leave it up for a while. I don't have copies of the first 2 books up here because they were $25 a piece on Amazon. I was just like, so it'll be a slow purchase. I do have a copy of the bottom book, If Stones Could Speak. So I have a copy of that one up here.
So when you have an urn, you have urn here, the ones that you showed they're enclosed, they have a cover on them. Now in Stratford, there's one that's like a cup. And it's been there, I don't know how long. And a robin always has her nest in there every year. And you know how persistent robins can be. You can
Yeah.
toss the nest and they'll start over again. So I think that the urn somehow got moved, so it's upside down now or something like that. Is that the same type of, when we talk about urns, or is that considered a cup?
It might
Of
be,
course, you don't have a picture of
that
it.
may
I
be a
don't-
cup.
Yeah.
There's a question about a cemetery that has an open urn where the cover's off, whether it's actually an urn or a cup. And there was also a comment how the robins tend to build nests in that poor urn all year. I have a feeling that might be a cup, which I don't have on the list because I haven't found one yet, but it usually is like the blood of Christ
Okay.
type thing.
Stratford.
Stratford, it's in Stratford.
Stratford,
Thank you.
easy.
I was trying to remember all the segments of the question. Next slide. You all done? Yes, sir. So there's a question about why someone have a Grim Reaper. Think of it as the angel of death taking the soul to heaven. It just means that that person's soul was physically taken to heaven. So that's that one. I had the Grim Reaper also had a broken pillar, and it had a person mourning. So it had a lot of symbolism in it. I have only come across 2 or 3 Grim Reapers in our state. But again, it's that angel of death taking the soul to heaven. So it's that person, the person who put the stone up really wanted to do the point that that person has gone to heaven. That's basically it. Or maybe they're just morbid too. But all right, let's go to the second page to get those. So I have these. I have all 3 of these books here for that. And the one that I like the best, if I can reach it, it's the second book, Stories Told in Stone. I bought this book years ago in the bargain section at Barnes and Noble for like $5. I have 2-3 copies of it. I couldn't find this one for the longest time. And then one day I opened up my glove compartment, there it was. Because I brought, I'll just bring it to cemeteries with me. I just forgot all about it. You can order this on Amazon now, but it now comes hardcover. But it has really great, it tells you pretty much the same thing I told you tonight. And it has really beautiful photographs of the different symbols and the stones. So if you're an avid cemetery person like I am, this is like my Bible. I love this book dearly. Yes, sir.
In northern Wisconsin, there's a small, I won't tell where it is because it's already been vandalized, but there's a small town cemetery that's way out in the middle of the woods. It's a little town. And in there's a gravestone to the family, and the daughter drowned falling in the well. She was 7 years old in 1912. And they have a little box, a wooden box with a glass window on it. And in it has a locket of her hair and a photograph of her China doll, and all these artifacts that have been there. And the town keeps, there's a neighbor who lives nearby, and then the town keeps that up.
Okay.
And then just down the way, there's a iron cross that's decorated with different scroll that was forged by one of the blacksmiths in town. And then there was one of these obelisk stones with oval photograph from so the iron cross is 1903, the obelisk was 1911, and the little box is 1912, which is really quite poignant, I guess.
All right. So we had a comment about a cemetery up in northern Wisconsin, talking about mementos in the cemetery with a young girl who dies in a well and has a lock of her hair, her doll, and some other trinkets, along with other items from the town's history that are preserved in the cemetery. Thank you very much. So one thing that I don't have photographs of, there were some marble stones that had little doors that you could open up, and there would have been a photograph of that person in that inside of that one time. But when you open them up now, the photos are long gone. But they were, like I said, you open up and there would have been a photograph embedded inside there at one time. And I don't come across those too often. Yes.
Genealogy number
up in Hillside Cemetery here in Marshfield. And her genealogy is on the back.
We just had a comment about genealogist was passed, and that at the Hillside Cemetery, her headstone has her genealogy on it, which is becoming more and more common nowadays. You're seeing a lot of family genealogies being put on the stones. Yes, ma'am.
Up in Wisconsin, there's you were talking about the photographs. This is a really old one. It's 1800s. And his photograph is still perfectly fine. Ever since I was a little kid, I was always, just intrigued. And of course, big mustache and it was common at that time, but it's just kept up. And northern Wisconsin has pretty brutal winters, so.
We just had a comment about a cemetery in Ashland, Wisconsin that still has a surviving photograph on it, and that unfortunately, like I said, once water gets behind it, they just pop. And so I remember as a kid, 10, 11, 12 years old, taking my bike to the cemetery and looking at all the stones that had faces on it. And I go back to that same cemetery, they're just open circles now, which is unfortunate. But they were really cool looking at everyone's faces on the stones. But you're starting to see that again now. It's really cool. And if you know who the family is, you can get photographs. They're not that expensive to remake and put them back in. Great. Another question.
On some of the stones, it looked like there was a sun in it. Not a star, but it looked like there was a sun.
I'll have to look it up.
Sunset.
I'm not sure. I'm trying to see if I can find it quick.
Your attention, please. The library will be closing in 20 minutes.
Oh, it's 20-minute announcement.
Meeting room reservations are now expiring. If you're using one of our meeting rooms, please gather your things and exit the room. If you have materials you would like to borrow, please check them out now. The library will be closing in 20 minutes. Thank you.
I didn't see that one. We had a question about what the sun means on a stone. So I'm checking my handy dandy Bible here. 114. Oh, I don't see it there either. Well, I found one that has a sun and the moon together, and that's more of a modern. It's another Christian symbol, and it's also part of the Freemasons. So it could be a fraternal order, it could be a Christian symbol. You have a question, sir?
Yeah, one more question. What do you know? You're Green Bay, man. So what do you know about the old French settlers cemetery?
So the question is, because I'm from Green Bay, he's asking about the early French settlers in Green Bay. There was a French cemetery in downtown Green Bay when the town of Astor, which is one of the villages that became Green Bay, was platted in 1835. They disregarded the cemetery and put a road across the middle of it. They did announce that they were going to decommission the cemetery. So the surviving French families in Green Bay at that time period moved the bodies from the French cemetery downtown to Alloy Catholic Cemetery. But again, some of those French voyageurs or French fur traders may have just been there by themselves and they may not have any of the family members. So there's still bodies downtown. And in 1888, when they were putting the waterworks in through, they were discovering bodies. So today, when the city does any type of work on Adams Street, they stay on those original trenches because they don't want to, if they dig up a body, they have to stop working because the state has to come in. So there's still bodies downtown in the French cemetery. There's a big boulder near it dedicating that this is a French cemetery. But the surviving families did remove the bodies of the early French, and they're now buried out at the Alloy Catholic Cemetery. And if they do uncover bodies when they're doing construction work, that body is reinterred at Alloy Catholic. So yeah, there's still bodies downtown where the French cemetery was. There's another question back there.
My teacher was also mentioning something about if your grave was built on a hillside due to the geology, that over time, there was an incident in the news where one of the coffins came out onto the highway due to the runoff.
So there's a comment about if you're buried on a steep hill, weather and rain can actually push the caskets out of the ground. And it's happened. There's cemeteries that are built up on bluffs or up on a ridge. And over time, as erosion happens, they start to slide down the hill. Yeah, and then I've noticed when the Mississippi River floods, they was talking about all the crypts that pop out of the ground and start going down river. So unfortunately, weather does push bodies, or that's why they have burial vaults, those crypts in ground, because that way they can and move, and they're all named, so they know where the people are. Which leads me to one more thing before we close up, and pretty soon, the old tradition of not walking on a grave is not for disrespect of the body. It's because today we have the concrete vaults that go in the ground, but 150 years ago, they were just pine boxes. So if you're walking across a grave 30, 40 years later, your weight would cause that casket to crush and you would drop down a couple feet. So that's why they don't have you walking across graves, because those caskets will crush. Today, we don't have to worry about it because everything is in concrete vaults. You don't have the settling you do back then, but that's one reason why you never walk across a grave back then, because you'll crush the casket. I've had it happen once, and it's just also you drop 6 inches. You're like, oh, all you can think of is like, oh my God, I just crushed the casket. Yeah, one question quick.
Have you noticed much vandalism?
There's a question about noticing vandalism in Green Bay. The cemetery tour that we're doing this week for the Historical Society has one grave. It was an architect who designed his own plot. It's beautiful. It's this big oval of granite with this big urn, and it was vandalized. The family was able to find his original drawings. They contacted the original quarry and had the pieces recut, and then had someone redo that center urn that got destroyed. So vandalism is still a big issue. That's why there's state laws that say you cannot be in cemeteries after dark. And you see a lot of cemeteries putting up trail cams to catch anybody going to the cemetery at night. But vandalism, and that's one reason why we do this talk, is to educate people that it's a final resting place. We should show respect for the cemeteries and appreciate cemeteries for what they are. Art pieces, parks, and also genealogy and family resting places. Anything else? One last, oh, there's one over there yet.
In Arlington National Cemetery, the veterans' graves have, there's 6 different symbols that they can have on their graves. And they have a cross or the Star of David, but there is a cross with a circle in it. And then there's the different religions do have different symbols also on the gravestones. And also there's difference between those that are died and those that were killed in action.
Yeah. So we had a comment about Arlington National Cemetery and the veteran stones and the symbols on the stones, whether they're Christian, Jewish. Sometimes it also depicted what corps they're a part of, and then whether they died in battle or died of natural causes. So thank you for that comment. All right, I think we're done. Thank you, folks.
Which book is